Hello, gardeners, homesteaders, and cooks. I am making a Smitten Kitchen recipe that I have never made before. If you've followed me for any length of time, you realize I'm pretty much a big fan of Smitten Kitchen. This is a Mediterranean eggplant salad. And I haven't grown eggplants for years because I'm not a giant fan of them. And then when I was growing for farmers markets, they tended to not sell super well, and they don't hold well. They're one of those rare plants that wants to be at about 50 degrees in storage, which of course is just an impossibility in a home kitchen. You can't put them in the refrigerator or they start turning brown on the outside. You can't leave them at room temperature. So they're hard to keep. And so it's one of those things where if you're going to grow them, you really need to be using them frequently. And I wasn't. And so I quit growing them for a long time. But this year I decided it had been a long time since I'd had any eggplant. And I do make a batch of moussaka every year, which is an eggplant dish, a Greek eggplant dish. That'll be on my future Cooking the Harvest videos. And so I just decided I would grow eggplant for the first time in a long time. I'll put the variety up on the screen. This is seed from Baker Creek. And I actually grew two different kinds of eggplant, and either I got the seed mixed up or, as has happened a lot this year, there was the wrong seed in the packet because one of them was supposed to be a small Japanese eggplant, and they're all this, which actually makes me think I probably mixed up the seed or mixed up the tags. But yeah, definitely not a Japanese eggplant. Japanese eggplant are long and skinny, and they're much smaller, and they tend to have less issues with bitterness. Although, honestly, I don't think eggplants tend to be that bitter in general. I think most of the current varieties that have been bred well don't have a ton of bitterness. You'll see a lot of recipes that call for salting eggplant and letting it sit and drain. And some of that is just an attempt to remove some of that bitterness. But I've never really eaten an eggplant where I was like, ooh, this is bitter. So I kind of leave it out. This recipe calls for dicing this and then roasting it. And so that's what I'm doing right now. So 1/2-inch cubes is what this recipe calls for. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. And this eggplant is new to me, and so I was really not sure when to pick it. I probably could have picked this slightly sooner. It's always a little hard to tell when to pick them so that the seeds aren't big. But these are fine. They'll be fine. I wasn't sure because I'd never grown the variety before. I wasn't sure how big it got. And the website didn't really give a lot of information on size. And so I was kind of winging it. I've got a bunch of them out there. They're incredibly productive. I'm going to make a really good batch of moussaka. It's going to be fun. So this salad is roasted eggplant and roasted zucchini. So it's definitely something we have both of in abundance in a summer garden. Instead of zucchini, I'm going to use these patty pan, and that one got away from me a little bit, so I'm just going to hollow it out and cut it up and use that. 1.5 pounds of eggplant, and actually I have closer to 2 pounds here, but because I don't have any other recipe to use an eggplant in right away, I'm just going to put it all in this one because, again, they don't hold well. So one of them was too small and 2 of them were too much. So I'm just going to err on the side of too much and have lots of eggplant in here. It's really easy for squash to get away from you size-wise. Everybody's had this experience. I literally just missed this one, but it's probably, like, it would have been perfect 24 hours ago. They just get so big so quickly. But you can definitely use them when they're oversized for more things than zucchini bread. You just scrape out this inner cavity that tends to be a little soft and spongy, and it's full of a little bit larger seeds that you would normally eat. But when it's big, the seeds are big. Just scrape that part out and use it as normal. It works just fine. These are a little fiddly to cut up compared to a zucchini just because the size is a little odd. But we have the ability to figure it out. And basically when you're thinking about and it's something says a half an inch or whatever, what they're really saying is bite-sized pieces. And so imagine you're eating this salad later, and what size do you want on your fork? That's really what we're doing here. So actually I left some of those probably a little bigger than I should have. I just kind of started thinking about that because we're not going to process it any further once it's roasted. It will shrink a little bit as it loses moisture, and so they will be slightly smaller when they come out of the oven than when they went into the oven. Shoot. But yeah, bite-sized pieces, whatever that means to you. My husband hates big bites. It's so funny. We've done this our whole marriage where I cook something and then he ends up cutting it up a bunch more after it's done. And I've learned to not bring him dinner. Yes, that's a very traditional thing, but he does not really cook. We have worked it out in terms of duties. But if I bring him, a piece of meat on a plate, like a steak or a pork chop or something, he will get up and go into the kitchen and cut the entire thing up into bite-sized pieces and then come back down and sit and eat it. So I've learned to not bring him his food. I just tell him it's ready and leave it on the kitchen counter for him. So these are called sheet pans. They look like a cookie sheet, but they're actually used in professional cooking. They're made out of aluminum, and they're thick enough that they don't warp with the heat of the oven. And so generally much better quality than a typical cookie sheet that you will buy at a big box store. The edges are, there's no seam. They're pressed. And so nothing moves on these. They stay where they're supposed to stay. They are fantastic. Don't worry about, people see the dirt on this, and I could scrub that for an hour and it wouldn't get a whole lot better. If I can scrub that hard and it doesn't come off, it's not going to come off in your food. So don't worry about things not looking pristine. This just means they're well loved and well used. But you can buy these at restaurant supply stores, or if you have something like a chef store or a Smart and Final. I know the names of those vary around the country, but they are less expensive generally than buying a regular cookie sheet at a big box store. So not only are they way better quality, but they also cost less. Find yourself a restaurant supply store and go buy yourself a couple of sheet pans. These are actually called half sheet pans because a professional oven is actually double. And so this together is a full sheet. These are half sheet. You can also buy quarter sheets, which are really handy for doing small batches of stuff or things in a toaster oven. But yeah, sheet pans, worth having for sure. We are going to toss this in 5 tablespoons of olive oil, and that's a good amount. And a lot of times I will back off on stuff like that. But in this particular case, because it's eggplant, which soaks up a lot of oil, and we want some texture and crispness and flavor, I'm just going to go ahead and leave that. This is 1/8 of a cup measuring cup. 1/8 of a cup is 2 tablespoons. And so I just grabbed that because it was quicker. We also need 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, regular table salt, not kosher. And then 3/4 of a teaspoon of black pepper. I'm just going to toss that all together so it'll get distributed. And the total recipe calls for a tablespoon or teaspoon each, or a teaspoon of salt anyway. So I'm sure the other half gets used, or the other part gets used somewhere else. I will fix it when I write when I put the recipe up. I hate it when they don't indicate in the ingredients that something is divided when they split where it's going. It's so annoying because sometimes you just read the ingredient instead of the text and you miss that it's been reduced. I could have used a bigger bowl, but I'm going to make the best of this because my bigger bowls are not in this kitchen. They're upstairs. So we're just going to do what we can here. And you can see that olive oil has just like disappeared, which is classic for eggplant. It's like a sponge. It really sucks up whatever you put on it. I might make an eggplant parmesan with all this eggplant too. That's another thing I haven't done in forever. I have a pretty good recipe for that where it's not deep fried. And so it's a little less fatty. It's pretty tasty. You know, you add enough cheese and really good tomato sauce to just about anything and it's going to taste good. All right. We're just going to divide this between these two sheet pans. Our oven is set to 425. By the way, these are, this is just parchment paper, and this is also something I get from a restaurant supply store. You can generally find it at a regular grocery store, but at a grocery store it comes in a roll, and it always curls because it's coming off of a roll, and it drives me crazy because it won't lay flat when I'm trying to do something. And so I finally bit the bullet. This was, I'm not kidding, 10 years ago. Bought a box of sheet pan parchment paper from a restaurant supply store. It was expensive, and at the time I could not really afford what I spent for it. I think it was like 28 bucks. That was probably 10 years ago, and I was at a point where I was really tight on money, and that was a lot to spend on something like that. But I literally, you can see it in there. I haven't used probably a quarter of the 1,000 sheets, and it is so nice because they lay flat. So yeah, if you can afford the splurge, just buy a box of parchment. Really, really nice. I've never regretted buying it. Okay, that looks approximately even. So 20 to 25 minutes at 425. And they suggest rotating the pans halfway through. I'm going to turn my convection on because that will help dry these out a little bit. A lot of what we're doing here with this roasting is just trying to reduce or remove some of the moisture because both of those things are quite moist. So I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes and we'll come back and see how things look. All right, our eggplant and zucchini, or actually patty pan squash, are out of the oven. I did end up cooking them for 25 minutes. I really wanted to get some browning on there. You can see some nice color because this is going to go into a salad and probably get pretty sogged out. And so I thought some texture would be good. So these are ready to go. All right, we are back to cook the barley portion of our roasted eggplant, squash, and barley salad. The recipe calls for a cup of sliced scallions. It does not indicate whether or not you should just use the whites or if you should use the greens and the whites. So I'm going to assume I can use the whole thing. And these are from my garden. Oops. Just taking off some of the outer layers, little schmutz. I love having a supply of green onions. They are so fresh and they're just so much faster than trying to grow a bulb onion. So you can have these as a backup when you're waiting on your main crop of onions to come in. And they're just awesome in so many different dishes as a topping or as a really bright layer. It's unusual that this recipe is having them sauteed in, then mixed into the cooked barley. It's kind of a unique thing. Normally regular onions would be used, and you could use regular onions if you didn't have scallions on hand. There's no reason why you couldn't just substitute a cup of regular chopped onion. That would work just fine. I always think of onions as somewhat interchangeable, especially in a cooked dish. They're getting away from me. This is a classic place where using the technique of curling your fingers into a claw is really helpful for not accidentally slicing. It's a little tricky to do because you have to keep readjusting. So I start my green onions in the greenhouse at the same time that I start my storage onions. So kind of mid-March for me here in Southeast Washington. I think that's enough. And the nice thing about them is you can plant them in clumps. And so instead of trying to do, you know, an individual row, you can just put 3 or 4 in a small pot to start in the greenhouse, and then just plant them out that way. Don't separate them. And then you just pull them up in a clump. You'll usually have some that are slightly larger and some that are slightly smaller. But it's a really nice way of grabbing a bunch of scallions all at once. And it saves a ton of time when you don't have to plant them out individually and try to get the rows nicely evenly spaced. So, all right, so a cup of scallions and about 5 that have fallen on the floor. And what we're gonna do is saute these in 2 tablespoons of oil in a large pot. I don't know why I'm measuring this. You could just eyeball it. And then to that, we're also going to bloom some spices in that oil. So we want a 1.5 teaspoons of cumin. Cumin is my favorite spice, and I've tried to grow it multiple times, and it's in the parsley family, I believe. I'll double check that. And we just don't have the right climate for it. I'm not sure what it is that it wants, but it is not what I have because I've tried it over and over again, and I always end up with really spindly little plants and a tiny little handful of seeds. I really wish I could grow it because I use so much of it. I buy it in bulk. So that was a 1.5 teaspoons of cumin, 1/2 teaspoon of coriander, and 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper. Both the coriander and the cayenne pepper are from my own garden. Cayennes are just a type of chili pepper, and I grow them every year and dry them and make my own cayenne chili powder. And then coriander is the seed from cilantro. And so if you've ever tried to grow cilantro and been super frustrated by how quickly it goes to seed because it really likes cool weather, and of course we want cilantro at the same time we have tomatoes for salsa, and it never seems to work out that way. But you can just let it go to seed and then collect that seed, and you have your own coriander. Coriander has a really lovely, it's very fragrant, it's lightly spicy, it's definitely citrusy. It has a wonderful scent to it. And sometimes it's used in baking applications and not just savory applications. So I love having fresh coriander on hand. And of course the whole seed lasts forever, and then you just grind it in a spice mill to make ground coriander. So I've been doing that for many years, and it makes me feel better about the fact that my cilantro always goes to seed in about 30 seconds. So we're gonna saute that in there until everybody starts getting happy. And many spices have lovely fragrance oils in them that are oil soluble rather than water soluble. And so if you do this where you saute them in a little bit of oil just briefly, they call it blooming the spices. And it is a really wonderful way to increase the flavor of those spices. Cumin especially is really lovely toasted. And so I often toast it before I grind it if I'm making ground cumin. All right. So in this bowl, I have 1.25 cups of barley. This is pearl barley. Everything's getting wilted, and toast it for a minute or two before we add our liquid. All right, so we're getting a little bit of toast on there. And then once this is, I'm probably gonna give this about another minute. Once this is finished toasting a little bit in that oil, we are going to add 1.75 cups of vegetable stock and then another 3/4 cup of just plain water. The vegetable stock that I use is actually a recipe from America's Test Kitchen that is a veggie stock concentrate. And I'll have to look up the ingredients. I'll post them below. You basically grind a bunch of different things together with quite a bit of salt, and you just freeze it. And then 1 tablespoon plus a cup of water equals an instant vegetable stock. I do remember that there were leeks in this, and then celeriac, which is similar to celery. And then I believe some tomato. I'm not 100% sure, I don't remember. But it's very handy to have in the freezer if you don't make a lot of vegetable stock. I love having this around to use. And you can see from the date on here, I made this in November of 2021, so it takes me a while to go through it all. But it freezes beautifully and it lasts pretty much forever. All right, we're starting to see a little bit of toast
on some of those grains, and that's what we want. We're looking for a little bit of flavor. We don't want to burn anything. And I'm just going to move this off heat to add this moisture because that pan is probably pretty hot and it's going to make a bunch of noise when we add that water. The other thing I like about this concentrate is that I can just add the liquid and then add the concentrate, and I don't have to actually I knew that was going to be noisy. I don't actually have to get my measuring cup dirty with the actual veggie concentrate. I can just put water in it and then throw it back on the drain rack because I didn't really get it dirty. So 1 3/4 cups, so we need a tablespoon plus 3/4 of a tablespoon. And this is frozen. This is still frozen, but I can basically kind of scrape off what I need. So it works quite well. We'll call that 3/4. And then we need another 3/4 of a cup of just plain water. All right, so we are already vigorously boiling here. I'm gonna put this on my tiny back burner, my simmer burner, as low as I can go. And this needs to simmer for about 40 minutes. And I'll come back and check it and give it a stir in about 20 minutes. And then see if it needs any more water. My back simmer burner is a little bit warm, and so we want to make sure this doesn't burn and stick. So you want to keep a close eye on it. All right, we'll be back in 40 minutes. All right, it's been 40 minutes. I did come in and stir this and added a little bit more water to it because it was starting to stick on the bottom a few minutes ago. I'm going to stir it one more time here off the heat. Taste it, make sure everything is tender. Yep, that's fine. All right, we're gonna let this sit and kind of steam off heat for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and cool it off. So this has been standing, kind of steaming in its cooling off juices for about 5 minutes. And now we're just gonna spread this on a sheet pan to completely cool it off. Give it one more quick stir. Barley is an interesting vegetable that I've been trying to do more things with. It's a very cold tolerant plant, and most of it, you know, traditionally has been used in beer making because sprouted barley, which is called malted barley, is the main ingredient in beer. But before that, it was a staple in northern countries because it did well with the cold. And so places like Scotland, definitely a big barley area. And while it has some gluten, it is not the same as wheat. And so sometimes you can tolerate barley a lot more than you can tolerate wheat gluten, even though it's not gluten-free. So it's an interesting grain, and I played around with it. I have barley flour that I use sometimes in recipes, and I'll substitute, you know, part of the wheat flour with barley flour, or sometimes all of it. I will link below. It's a pamphlet that was put together by the Culinary Breeding Network, I think, on barley. They call it a barley zine, so like a barley magazine. And it's got some great recipes in there and some really interesting history about it. Most barley is hulled, so it comes with a coating on it that has to be mechanically removed. And so that's part of why it has fallen out of fashion as a cooking grain. because it takes a lot more work to do that, and wheat is hullless. But there are some varieties of hullless barley where you don't have to take that hull off. It falls off automatically. And so there's actually Oregon State University is doing a really interesting breeding program where they basically got seed. There's a national archive of seed in the country, and you can order it if you're doing research. You can order samples to do grow outs. And so they ordered every barley that was in the national seed bank, and then any other barley they could find from seed growers and seed catalogs and all over the country and probably all over the world. And then they've just been doing grow outs and experiments to try to find hullless barley so that they could make it a more popular grain, because it is really good for colder climates. It'd probably be good in terms of adaptation with climate change. So yeah, fun stuff around barley. I tried to grow a little bit of it myself. Unfortunately, the mixed seed from OSU was so mixed that some of it got finished really early, some of it got finished really late. It was really hard to harvest because the harvest times were all over the place. And so it was kind of somewhat of a failed experiment on my part in terms of playing with it. But yeah, very fun barley. We'll be back in a few minutes once this is cooled. Barley has been cooling for 20 minutes, give or take, probably a little longer. I went out to the garden to get a few more things. We're gonna put together the dressing here. Start with 2 tablespoons of fresh squeezed lemon juice. It's not going to be a very juicy lemon because it's been sitting on my counter for a day or so. Let's see what we can get out of the other half of this. Should be better. Oh yeah. And this is an 1/8 of a cup measuring cup, and an 1/8 of a cup is 2 tablespoons. So I'm just throwing it in there as a rough idea of if I have enough or if I need to get out another lemon. And I think that's gonna be close enough. Actually, I have a lime sitting here. I'm just gonna finish that off with a little bit of lime, just to use it up. All right, 2 tablespoons lemon juice, 1 clove of garlic. Set that right there. And this garlic is super fresh, so it's gonna be super easy to grate down. Always a pleasure to work with really fresh garlic. The nice thing, I think I've mentioned this before, that I love about these rasp graters is they really don't, they really don't eat your hands. And so you can do this and not worry about, maybe it'll take some of the ground in weeding dirt off my fingers. I took a picture for a thumbnail for a video I'm doing that I haven't posted yet on salsa, and I had a corn chip in my hand with the salsa on it, and my hands, even though they were clean, looked so bad that I had to go back and reshoot the thumbnail. This is a hard time of year on hands with all of the weeding. All right, 2 tablespoons lemon juice, 1 clove garlic, tiny bit of sugar, 1/4 teaspoon, 1/4 teaspoon table salt, 1/4 teaspoon black pepper. I'm just gonna eyeball that. This little pepper mill is pretty efficient. Maybe a few slightly chunky bites of garlic in there, but I don't think it's gonna hurt anything. And we want 3 tablespoons of oil. There's nothing in here to emulsify this. So no matter how much I whisk it or how slowly I drizzle this oil in, it's still gonna separate almost immediately. So I'm not super worried about that. I'm just gonna throw it in here, and then we're gonna pile some veggies on top of it. We'll make sure the garlic gets mixed into that oil so that that oil gets a little bit garlic flavored before we start throwing everything else in the mix here. All right, so that's our dressing. I need a cup of fresh parsley. This is flat leaf parsley from my garden. And I'm just gonna really quickly strip the worst of the stems out of that. Stems are totally edible, but not necessarily tasty. A little bit fibrous, as you can tell by how hard I'm having to pull here to get the leaves off. And I just kind of eyeballed this. Parsley is very mildly flavored, so like if I have a little extra, it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to overwhelm the dish the way it would if it was, say, dill or cilantro. Parsley's pretty tame. All right. And the easiest way to do this is to kind of try to pack it in. It's not 100% successful, but if you can get it in a bunch, it's going to be much easier to chop with that initial run through. Oop. This is kind of an unwieldy pile. And I'm going to treat this a little bit like it's a tabbouleh salad, so I'm going to leave this parsley kind of chunky. I'm not going to just pulverize it. I think that flavor burst against what else is in here is going to be really tasty. Okay, that looks like about a cup. There's a cup. I need a half a cup of chopped fresh mint. This is spearmint. I'm really not a fan of peppermint for cooking with. I like it as a tea. I think it's way too strong to actually put in dishes. I'm also not just generally a big fan of mint in anything, so I'm gonna go kind of easy on this. I keep trying it. I'm learning to like it more, but I also think it can really easily overpower something. So this is a good example of where we don't want to have too much. And this is a patch of spearmint, or mojito mint is what it was called when I bought it, which I think is just funny, that I planted next to one of the hose bibs that leaks a little bit. And so there's kind of a nice patch of mint out there that I just completely ignore until I need mint, because it grows in a pretty good sized patch because of that slightly dripping hose bib. But it doesn't really spread much further than that because there isn't water anywhere else. So a little harder to pack this into a wad. All right. So calls for half a cup That might be a little short on that, but I'm okay if we have a little less than what it calls for. You really don't want it to overwhelm the salad. We need a 1/2 pound of cherry tomatoes. This calls for them to be quartered. Some of these are really small. This particular variety of cherry tomato is called honey drop, and so it's small. Clearly does not need to be quartered. In fact, I think it could probably just go in whole and be fine. But I will quarter some of these others. It's a really lovely, sweet little tomato, but it's a little too small. I won't grow it again just because I didn't realize it was going to be so tiny. I'm not a fan of something that doubles the amount of time it takes for me to pick it. And this definitely takes a long time to pick because it's small and so you don't get very much. All right, the rest of these I will at least cut in half. And I'm not worried about this cutting board being clean because the only things on it is the stuff that is already in the salad, so. So it calls for 1/2 pound, which is 8 ounces, which is about a clamshell's worth. I sell clamshells of cherry tomatoes, so I have a pretty good sense. I'm going to put a few more in there. Got a few more of these little honey drops. I just picked these a few minutes ago. It's summer. I don't think you can ever have too many cherry tomatoes when it's a summer salad. We are going to a potluck birthday party of a friend of ours, and so this wasn't the original idea, but because I hadn't finished making it until today, it was the perfect thing to take to a potluck. 1/3 cup Kalamata olives. These are always so hard to get out of the container without draining all the juice, which I do not want to do. All right, that's probably about right.
Give these a quick.
I'll slice some of them long ways, some of them half. I also need 1/2 cup of a thinly sliced red onion. And these are drying on my front porch right now. They're going to be a little bit hard to peel because they're still pretty fresh. They haven't dried down. I'm pretty flush with onion right now, so I'm not going to worry about trying to save every single layer. And it's going to save me time to just strip off that outer bit. Looks like it could use one more trim. Normally I leave the stem intact when I'm slicing, but that's usually when I'm dicing. And in this case, I'm gonna thinly slice it this way. And that's pretty easy to do, even when the stem is not intact. One of the suggestions for fresh onion, if you don't want it to be super sharp and overpower, is you run some cold water through it. And it helps a lot with that super sharp bite. I am not a big fan of raw onion because the flavor stays with me for a really long time. And so I do like this technique because it does help cut some of that sulfurous, sharp onion flavor. All right, I think we're ready for our roasted veg. So here is that was that giant patty pan squash and 2 whole eggplants. You can see how much those roasted down. This container, I think, is 8. Yeah, this is an 8-cup container, and it wasn't all the way full. I would probably say that was about 6 cups. So that veg definitely shrunk quite a bit with the roasting, which is good because it concentrates the flavors. I'm just going to give everything a stir, and then we'll throw the barley in. Almost forgot the barley. Honestly, that looks great even without the barley. You could make this lower carb and just leave the barley out. Isn't that gorgeous? All right, I'm just going to use my hands because this is going to be messy as all get out. I think it's going to be easier to do. And remember, we put some oil in the bottom of that before we added the water to cook this barley. So this has got some pretty good oil on it. So it's not sticking to itself, which is really nice. The one thing I think I would change, this recipe didn't call for adding any salt to the cooking water. I mean, the vegetable stock had quite a bit of salt in it, but I feel like just eating it out of hand, it could use a touch of salt. It's not bad, but I'm going to make a note on the recipe if I make this again to add maybe a half a teaspoon of salt to the water when you're cooking the barley. I feel like it needs a little bit. Wow, this is just brilliant. It's all the garden goodness. So let's see, out of everything in here, we have mint, parsley, tomatoes, onions, garlic, eggplant, and zucchini that all came from the garden. What an awesome summer salad that is. And I'm just trying to make sure everything is mixed well, that there's not any pockets of stuff that hasn't been well distributed. It smells amazing, you guys. I'm just going to taste this for seasoning. I'm going to try to get a piece of squash and eggplant. That's a pretty big bite. Oh yeah, that's really good. This recipe is new to me. The eggplant is super creamy. The squash has got a little bit more texture. And you've got the brightness of the parsley and the mint and the onion. Yeah, that is really, really good. Highly recommend it. Make this from goodies from your garden or goodies from the farmer's market. Well worth it. Mediterranean, eggplant, and barley salad. Yum.